Morning, everybody. Yes, the presentation is about how to define the right level of information and its modeling in infrastructure project. First, just to consider the way to define an exchange, which is not only I give you something, there is something like a procedure, and we have to well define what we ask and to verify in the same way. So we have to have the same definition of to qualify the information. So the question of the level of detail of information have to be defined in the same way from the people who ask and the people who receive this information. So it's a question of beam use, and the question about LODs is where is in fact the question of LODs? Is that only at this place? In fact, here is the answer. To me, is the answer after having used system engineering, and we'll see what have to be considered at the beginning before defining the question, the LODs of information you exchange. So I won't here answer the question of LODs or level of detail, level of development, and so on. It's another subject. But here is to just to define what's the level of detail address. There is, of course, the question of graphic representation, exchange information, other element, non-graphic and non-geometrical information, but also the question of reliability, compliance, completeness of information, which is in fact implicitly included in the question of level of detail already. And the last point is more about beam uses, how to reach requirement to answer to the project requirement and how to make this. So we thought that the question of system engineering was a good way to define which system we study and how to identify the good requirements to answer and to reach. So at the beginning, we apply system engineering on the whole project. So it's very macro approach. So we have here some classical approach of the system engineering, which we have just to consider here the fact that there is a product system, what we have to produce. So is a big part is the information we have to product, manage, and exchange. And the other part is the project system, which are more the process to make this product system. So this is the first part. In system engineering, there is this approach which could be interesting, and the second part of another part of system engineering is the question of requirements. And we really want to answer the requirements of the project, the aim, in fact, of the project. So we classified requirements this way. You have the requirements about the product system, and also the requirements about project system. We won't here consider this part, just we base our approach on product system. So yeah, we consider only this part. And after to consider this, the question is which information we have to exchange, how do we have to model the exchange information. So this was applying system engineering on the whole project. After, we have to consider a subsystem. We have seen something like that just before. So we define only, for example, here we identify the drainage system, which is the system, the product system, which is a part of the whole product system. Here, only in the design phase, we consider it. So it's not the real drainage system, but the numerical drainage system, in fact. And we define this way different systems, and we apply system engineering at different scale of the project. So we have drainage system, but also noise system with noise protection and so on. So after doing this, the question is really, now we have the system, we can identify requirements we have to reach, and so the question of the level of detail of the information we have to exchange and we have to get manage and to make to really reach the requirements. So here it's just to explain that in the way to model something, there is the first approach is the question of abstraction. So, and what we see in some paper and so on is that now today the question of abstraction should be not for everybody, but for some people who have to make the architecture of the information, to structure information. The abstraction is more important than the question of manual agility. It was about the concept, but the question of domain skills. So here you have proposed approach of modeling, which the first step is you have domain ontology or all the domain terms. We have to make the abstraction of this to define. So it's the first step of the BEMUs. In fact, we have the abstraction of the reality. To define after that the question of object, so we simplify this reality and we get object, attribute, semantic, and so on, everything in the question of level of detail of the information. And the last part is really the question of format, standard, how we will exchange this information. But this is not the most important. There are lots of work about it. So just here is to identify that the question of the abstraction is the first step to well define, in fact, the question of level of detail of information. So that was one of the results of applying system engineering. And if we apply this to the whole project, you can see here some BIM elements, the BIM execution plan, the question of BIM use, IDM, NVD, and so on, and all the conceptual data farm. All the information, so the product system we have to make and to produce in the design part. So here, to me, the question of abstraction is really here at the beginning. So to define the BIM use, to describe them, and to define which requirements we have to reach in all the BIM uses, is a question of abstraction. Which parts of the project we have to take in consideration to answer, and so which information are we waiting for from other stakeholders. After that, only there is a question of level of something, whatever what you want, level of detail, level of information, and so on. And so to define the processes, IDM, the processes, and MVD, all the parts of the whole model you have to exchange. Then here we can add the question of BIM use. In fact, to me, BIM uses are just here, these parts, blue part. And what we can see is BIM use address, in fact, the question of product system and also the processes, the way to exchange and so on, all these elements. So that's the reason that we thought at the beginning that system engineering could be an interesting way of thinking to define this BIM use, because they address both parts, product system and the product system and the process, really the project, the processes. So what about the experimentation? I won't give you too much detail, but it's just to see the process. At the beginning, we identified all stakeholders working on the system. So here could be the drainage system. So we have all the stakeholders. This to help to identify all the requirements which concern this system. And we have different approaches in system engineering: operational, functional, organic, and so on. So you have here some details. And so here is the first part, identifying stakeholder, identifying requirements, and only after that we can ask the question of abstraction, how we will model the information to well reach the requirements. So here it's just a choice. We define only about each object the question of attributes, dimensionality, and representation. And we have, for example, here you have one requirement, one representation. And here, for different requirements, you will have the same object but with another representation. So at the same stage of the project, for different requirements, you really do not have to model all the objects in the same object in only one way. You have a lot of representation, modeling of the same object to reach different requirements. Yes, it was. This is a question of pipe, which are in fact not really modeled in the first for the first requirement, operational requirements, and in the second part, of course, it's 3D object to make the sizing and also clash detection and so on. So here, to come back to this exchange process, just to notice that the question of abstraction is really at the beginning. So the stakeholder who asks you the question, who asks you for information, have to ask himself the question of abstraction. What do I want to have in terms of information? What do I need, in fact? And what do I need regarding the question of requirements I have to reach in my part of the project? And after only you have the question of LOD and so on, different dimension of this concept. So to conclude just some elements, so system engineering seems to be relevant to study all the project, but also parts of the project, to in fact define the requirements of these parts of the project, and after only to define the question of the level of detail of information. We notice that it's not so easy to implement system engineering and requirement engineering, of course, but in infrastructure projects we have lots of discussion. In also French project, research projects, it's not so easy. And the last point is that, to keep this in mind, that because in defining BIM execution plan, usually we say, okay, how to define the matrix of LODs, and we start with defining this regarding the question of deliverables, sorry. And so here we just explain that the first question is really the requirements, and after only to take care about the question of level of detail of information. Just 2 points about perspective, how to integrate all the LOXs, means all the question of LOD, LOE, and so on. How to make them more in the whole project, to only, because it's defined as a tool, how to consider it as a really cognitive process to make the design, so how to improve in different phases, and not only to be based on scales and deliverables. And also a question is, if we do not consider and define all the venues of the project, is this method can be applied only in a part of some requirements? How to identify only interesting or relevant requirements to define it this way, and the other requirements to consider them in a classical way, if you can say. Okay, thank you very much.